Alex, thank you so much for joining us today. It's great to have you in the office and great to have you as one of our first podcast guests. So welcome aboard.
Thanks for having me.
I just wanted to start off and ask you a little bit about your professional background. I know you're someone who's been in the content and journalism space for almost a decade, maybe even a little bit over, actually. So give us a little bit of background about where you've worked and kind of how your careers have evolved.
Yeah, well, I'm an editor at Forbes. We're the magazine and site and do some other fun stuff too. And I've been there for 6 years, a little over actually. And before that, I was at another publication with a very similar name. So a lot of people thought I was actually just working at the same place throughout, and that was Fortune magazine, so very similar. And I was there for about 1.5 years and worked there also in college. And so that takes me all the way back to, my first paying gigs, and that would have been around 2010, I think, was when I really got, ramped up into the tech reporting that I do today.
Excellent. So what is your current position at Forbes? What do you focus on? And maybe more importantly, which verticals are you kind of known for and do you steer?
I don't know if I'm known for any verticals, but I hope to be. I am an associate editor, which is sort of a mid-level position. It means that I don't actually manage people, but I've been there for a while. And I am the editor of 2 of our flagship lists. So I'm the editor of the Midas list, which is the list of the top 100 venture capitalists in the world, a list that we've been doing for 19 years. And I've been doing for, increasingly for 4, but involved with for 6. And then I started a list that has happened a couple of years. It started in 2016 called the Cloud 100 list. And that is the 100 fastest growing private cloud companies in the world. So think Slack or Dropbox when it was private, those kind of companies that people use in the office and a lot of people have heard of probably.
These lists are a really interesting part of the bigger brands. Can you talk about what's the strategy behind them for a big organization and how that kind of interacts with the rest of the content and the strategy of Forbes?
Totally. So Forbes has been around for over 100 years. We celebrated our centennial last year. And Forbes really was the first big business publication, national publication. And part of what made it resonate with the public was that we started tracking the world's billionaires. And so for better or worse, we were kind of the people figuring out how much these people were really worth, what they were involved with, how they were all connected to each other. And we would get really interesting stories out of covering those billionaires. So that list has been a key part of our strategy for decades. And then we've kind of added more lists over time. The second most popular one at Forbes is the 30 under 30, which David might be familiar with. But it started out as just 30 people. Now it's 30 people every year in 20 different verticals and celebrating their success, their entrepreneurial spirit. And we get a ton of interest in that and also the related events we do. Then if you look, basically, our lists have kind of covered other areas of interest to us and issues of the magazine. So for example, the Cloud 100 issue comes out in September. I kind of took that over when we started the list in 2016. And that's really focused on an area of technology. But then we have lists for the highest paid celebrities. Like if you want, if you were Googling how much did a rapper make, there's a good chance that you would be looking at our Forbes data. And we also do how valuable sports franchises are. So if you're curious, are the Yankees more valuable than the Red Sox? You'll go to ESPN or something, but ultimately they're sourcing Forbes data. So we kind of, these lists have given us a lot of credibility, and then they allowed us to build verticals around each one, if that makes sense.
Cool. I wanted to chat a little bit about these centerpiece features, and Forbes is known for these lists. Forbes also produces thousands of blog posts a day, which I want to get to in a second. But before that, you work both on Forbes.com, where most of your writing lives, but also you write extensively for the print magazine, including the cover stories. Just for our listeners who might be kind of new to some of your writing, what are some of the favorite covers that you've worked on, maybe some of the favorite or more interesting people you've profiled in those cover stories?
Sure. So the first cover story that I wrote by myself was about one of the first investors in Uber, a guy named Chris Sacca. Listeners may remember he was on Shark Tank for a long time, had a sort of rivalry going with Mark Cuban, which he now maintains over Twitter. And so I got into kind of some of the early drama around the creation of Uber and the big personalities involved, and met some crazy people through that story, from the other Uber folks to Tim Ferriss and Tony Hawk, like a very interesting crew that were around this guy. And I've also done profiles of people like the CEO of Salesforce, Mark Benioff, where I went to Japan and Hawaii with him, which was very interesting. He probably took a much nicer plane than me. I was in the middle seat all the way to Tokyo. And then I've also most recently done a cover story in December with a colleague on Satya Nadella, who has really turned around Microsoft and took it from a sleepy company to a cool place to work, and sometimes, based on the day, the most valuable company in the world. So, usually these really, successful business leaders or the investors who are backing those massive companies.
Mm-hmm. When you're thinking about Forbes and like doing these great investigative journalism pieces, like what separates you from the story of big media that everyone's kind of telling? Like, it's hard to invest in these things, it's hard to keep it going. Like, why is the Forbes brand like resonated so much and allowed it to like keep up and investing in this quality of journalism?
Yeah, I mean, so first off, every company I've worked at had layoffs. Fortune had layoffs, I think the week that I started as an intern, and Forbes, they just happened before my time. But, I think most media publications go through cycles of boom and bust. And we've been really fortunate in my years at Forbes to keep hiring, keep expanding. But that's, I think, a combination of really doubling down on what makes your brand unique, and also other factors that you can't really control. Like, if you depend on Facebook video and then the algorithms change, you can be caught in a bad place. I'd say Forbes, our editor-in-chief made a really smart bet on events and building communities that have been sort of insulated from other trends. People still want to meet, they still want to network. And we found that whether things are going great or bad in the economy, people still want to be entrepreneurs. They still want to find paths to success. So Forbes has sort of really focused on millennial and sort of aspirationally entrepreneurial spirits. And that can go from billionaires all the way down to students. And I think that's given us an identity that allows us to kind of stay defined in a situation that can be very murky, and one that, frankly, I sometimes worry about from sort of that big picture.
How has the content strategy at Forbes, the orders from on high, from the editor-in-chief and the different editors, how has that evolved as Forbes has expanded its roster of events and summits?
Yeah, so I mean, one thing that's great about Forbes is we do kind of practice what we preach with the entrepreneurial spirit. So the Cloud 100 was something I created with an external partner, and now we have a big event, and sort of a lot of that is sort of run with what works and keep expanding it. But I would say that, otherwise, the editors are encouraging my peers to think, what is something you could own? Like, we are about to have a women's summit in Israel in a few weeks. And my colleague, who was recently named the head of our Forbes Women channel, is currently deep in sort of planning that and making sure it's a great experience. So I would say that the most important thing has been that smart delegation to find ambitious people and basically say, this is your franchise to grow within our brand. And that's worked well for us.
Who do you think about as like your competitors at Forbes? Are you competing with one big other brand like yours, or is it kind of like a bunch of smaller people that are, someone's in events or someone's in this type of content or that type of thing? Like, who do you keep your eye on?
I mean, I'm curious. I'd almost be more curious what you guys think, when you think of Forbes, who you see as our competitors, because, it might be very different. But I would say, from my standpoint, we have the magazines that are very similar. We have then the sites that are producing really similar content. So Fortune, my old employer, is a good one. Bloomberg, or, to some degree, the Wall Street Journal, or, these other places. But there's always newcomers. Like Axios is now a place that a lot of people go for news. The Information does really great work. I have a couple former colleagues who are now there. So, I mean, the landscape kind of changes, and it also depends on what you write about. So we have great sports money writers who are doing, business profiles on athletes. They could be competing with Players Tribune and being disintermediated by the athletes just writing themselves. I'm to some degree competing with blogs and other forms of media where the people that I talk to are going straight to their audiences too. So it kind of depends how meta you want to get, but in a way we're competing with podcasts, we're competing with people like a Tim Ferriss just for attention.
Right.
So I find that really interesting personally.
When it comes to balancing, and this is something I've noticed as an old friend of yours who's been following your career, there's a big time investment, a big resource investment on the part of Forbes and on your behalf when it comes to writing, be it a cover story or a list. But you also produce a lot of, week in and week out, a lot of shorter form pieces that are living primarily, if not only online. And Forbes.com produces a huge range of content. It could be something in the sports realm, in the business realm. It could be Game of Thrones roundups and recaps, and Forbes.com is going toe-to-toe with a lot of entertainment websites on those. So, how are you specifically, in your experience, balancing where you're spending your time? Is it, more time on a lot of shorter articles that can kind of get traffic or take advantage of news cycles, or these bigger tent post pieces that, could take weeks of your time?
Yeah, you have to kind of try to be pacing your wins is how I think about it. And so you always want to be doing the prestige or big projects that will be noticed the most or impact your career the most, and also give you the greatest sense of accomplishment. But you put yourself in a bad position and at risk of kind of being incentivized by the wrong things if you're kind of banking on those and then in these kind of long periods of sort of hibernation. So I kind of try to put points on the board by having these shorter articles to kind of pace me. And I'm pretty much always working on multiple long-term projects, and you just don't really know when they're going to hatch. So like right now I'm working on I think, future splashy article where I've done all the reporting, and now I need to find the time to really make sure that I can clearly write it. We just photographed the people. That'll probably come out, in anywhere from 1 to 3 weeks from now. Then I'm working on a big investigation, which I've already spent a ton of time on, and I have no idea when it'll finish. So in the meantime, I'm going to write these articles that are more what we consider beat coverage, which is more like being part of the conversation in the topics you care about.
Mm-hmm. We've had Ash on previously, who you know as well, and he was kind of mentioning training in journalism and how he feels like he really benefited from being trained by a very skilled journalist, and that doesn't exist as much. Do you feel like Forbes has like a really good structure for training you, and that you are passing along the craft? And if so, like, how do you all structure that in terms of like your day to day and like deciding like, oh, here's how you investigate a big story, here's how you churn day to day, like how is that ingrained in you over time?
Yeah. Well, it's funny because that taps into something I've been thinking about a lot in the last couple of days, because my girlfriend works in venture capital, and she tweeted about an article she saw from another outlet that I will not name that was basically glorifying a entrepreneur for reaching a big scale with their business with zero domain expertise at all. And it was sort of, this person reached X big company with zero expertise. And the kind of the implication is that that's more impressive or more admirable to kind of fake it till you make it or something. And I think that is a dangerous mindset that a lot of people have today. You can reach amazing success with just a fresh perspective or a different way of thinking of things, but I don't think you're setting yourself up. And in media, it's exactly the same. People want to make their, a name for themselves really fast. But if you don't learn that sort of more gritty training, it can set you up for bad situations. For example, a PR person from Uber calling you at 1 a.m. to, upset with what you're about to publish, or God forbid you make a mistake. How do you, respond to that in a professional way and not overcorrect. So all of that does come from training. The one thing that Forbes does that I would highlight is every writer has to fact check other writers. So at a certain point, you can graduate out of that. I think I did it for over 3 years. So at this point, still over half my time at Forbes. But every print article in Forbes and every daily cover story, which is our sort of more work-intensive article that we lead with the website every day, those were basically peer fact-checked. And you see how the other person reports. You see what they did that was smart. You see what they did that you would have done differently. And it gives you this great experiential sense of sort of, this is what is good reporting.
Mm-hmm. Cool. Well, jumping off that, talking about the craft of journalism, you got into the media space. Full disclosure, we were actually both at Fortune for, we had a slight overlap.
Not very long.
Not very long. I didn't stay there too long. And at that point, print media was, the writing on the wall was that print media was dying, and everyone was wondering if the Fortunes and the Forbes of the world were going to survive. The role of journalists, the answer is they have survived. But the role of journalists has definitely changed. Back then, it was my dream for a while to be just a writer, someone who's working on print magazine stories, and that's what I focused on. You rarely see that level of specialization today. You see journalists as influencers. You yourself have a very large Twitter following. You're on a lot of panels. I see you in autoplay videos on Forbes.com. You guest on podcasts. How have you? Is that something that you've kind of fallen into, or something that you've been a little bit more intentive with? And how do you think that's going? What do you think the next evolution of that's going to be?
Yeah, well, I mean, clearly the route has worked decently well for both of us, because you did make our 30 under 30 list for your work in media in sort of that new media side. And so I think there's definitely paths in both routes. I would say that no matter what, I think it's important to build your personal brand these days in media. Gone are the days of just doing a good job and then kind of marching up the ladder. I think, especially because you can build this internal credibility that doesn't translate in another environment. So I fear for the people who are lifers at a publication and then may want to either try something else or may have to try something else. And it's hard for all that success to show up in some sort of visible way. So, I mean, I definitely didn't anticipate how much time I would spend on Twitter or engaging with my competition or soliciting feedback from, know-it-alls who think they could have done the story better. But that gives you an audience, and it makes you authentic. And I think it forces you not to take yourself too seriously. And so I think those days of maybe writing a magazine article almost in a monastic way and then releasing it onto the world like you're dropping an album, not a reality anymore.
Yeah, and many feels like everyone's career goes a little bit differently than they expected, right? But in terms of the new digital landscape, like you have to interact in this totally new way, which I think is kind of interesting, new like to previous generations. Do you feel like people have figured it out now? Or are we in this stage where like it's still like this nebulous, like what am I supposed to be doing as a person in media, as a person in journalism? Like there's so many different types, and like especially with the rise of influencers individually, like some people you've mentioned that are like putting out news in their own way. Like where do you all fit in? And like, do you think people are like coming to terms with it, or are we exploring a new path forward right now?
I mean, I feel like if I had the answer to that, I'd probably be running my own highly successful media company. But to take a stab at it, I think sort of the day-to-day answer is we are adapting on the fly to what sort of people seem to want. And so, I think we all probably spend more time on Instagram professionally or personally than we would have maybe anticipated a couple of years ago. Less time on Facebook, perhaps, at least for some of us. I mean, I'm not growing my personal brand on Facebook the way that I might have thought I would, in 2011. And Twitter, is this amazing resource, but it also is an echo chamber. And if you look at the raw numbers, it's not most people. So where is everybody? We're always just, I think, looking for an audience. And so that is sort of reactive. But then I would say kind of zoomed out, I think everybody is kind of waiting for some big platform shift. Like, if you think about it, the iPhone came out, 2008, 2009 it was popularized? 2007 was the first one? Okay, so that was over a decade ago. And now it feels a little late cycle. People are increasingly not replacing their phone every year. You probably have so many apps on your phone that you're not downloading a ton of new apps. Like, this is a pretty mature ecosystem. What comes after mobile? A lot of the great media companies and personalities have kind of, in my mind, capitalized on a new trend, whatever it is. So who are the most popular podcasters? I think a lot of them are the people who kind of have been the first ones to take a chance in the space. Who are the most popular gaming streamers? They're people who were streaming on Twitch when that was not an obvious thing to do. So I think, who are the early adopters of the next thing? Like, we don't know yet, if that makes any sense at all.
One thing I find interesting about now as compared to when you and I were kind of getting into the media space was I still had this idea in my head, especially in college, that if you worked for a magazine, that magazine had its subscribers, it had its super fans who got the majority of their news, their information, their opinion, their perspective from that magazine, because that's the one they subscribe to. Like, I subscribed to Time magazine as a kid, right? So much of my worldview was colored through the lens of what they were writing, what they were covering, and then I had a bunch of gaps because those were the things not covered in Time magazine. Now we're consuming so much information, and we're doing it in a cross-platform way that people are bouncing around between publications. It's not just where do you get your news, it's where are the 5 places you get your news and opinions. It seems to me, and I'm curious as to your thoughts here, that people in media, especially journalists, are more willing these days to, whether it's share information, link to each other, reference each other, go on each other's podcasts, go on each other's shows. It seems like there's more collaboration between, in theory, competing media outlets than ever. What are your thoughts on that? Is that a trend you've been seeing, and do you see that continuing?
That's a really interesting point, and I'm not sure if it holds up at the company level, but it might be more about the people at these companies. I mean, let's look at the NBA. You see a lot of debate about whether the players get along too well. You think about the New York Knicks, our local team in the 90s. They were known as nasty. Michael Jordan, their contemporary, wasn't famous for being friends with players on the other teams or even his own team. And now NBA players, they're all kind of dabbing before the game. They co-invest together. I think they see the bigger picture beyond like what jersey they're wearing. And I think that's kind of true more and more in other industries. And so I think if you're if you're an employee at a media company, you can't know that you're going to be there forever. And the person at the competing outlet may not be there forever. There's a good chance that you'll work together at one or other of the outlets or a third mystery outlet. We just hired a new awesome tech reporter in San Francisco who worked with one of my other great colleagues 2 jobs ago. And so I think at this point, it's an industry where there's enough movement and there's enough uncertainty that it's kind of short-sighted to take an us versus them mentality against anyone. Now, do the brands themselves compete? Probably. But I'd be shocked if engineers at tech companies weren't finding camaraderie with other engineers, or designers at, commerce companies. I think there's a lot more community among, certain professionals, and I think you also see that with things like Slack channels for people in similar roles across companies. PR people have Slack channels or where they just sort of compare best practices, or people who run social media pages, and because they're going through the same things, right?
Right. So in that spirit, we'll ask you, who right now is impressing you in terms of the type of content they're making or how they're getting it out there? Whether they're a big brand or a smaller brand, kind of up and coming.
Good question. I would say in terms of Video production, the Vice video team is still doing an amazing job. And I think they're innovating on a few new projects that are kind of cool. We're actually trying to get into that space too with some Forbes media stuff. But I think video is not played out. And so I like to see new experiments there. I would say, there's some interesting newsletters that are becoming popular. I've even seen people joking like our newsletter is the new podcast. A couple of my favorite writers just started one, but I think Ben Thompson at Stratechery is still kind of the gold standard newsletter writer. And then in terms of sort of engaging with audiences, I'd say the most impressive people I've seen are like Taylor Lorenz at The Atlantic, who writes about Instagram and sort of social media culture. She's built an amazing personal brand around that, really owning that space. And then there's another woman named Chrissy Farr at CNBC, who's become kind of the scoop queen for all like health news. Like when Amazon was working on, maybe working on a healthcare project, like she's on it. And what's interesting is people are almost like waiting for her to weigh in on Twitter when one of those things happens. So, I like what they're doing with audiences. And then in terms of site design, I think, I like The Athletic. I think it's cool what they're doing. And a few of these kind of paywall new media companies are really kind of prioritizing quality in a way that I like.
You're someone who has a courtside seat and a unique perspective, maybe closer than almost anyone else I've ever encountered when it comes to investment trends in media, where VCs are putting their money, where institutional and individual investors are putting their money when it comes to media companies. Without getting into specifics that maybe you can't divulge, what kind of trend do you see occurring, if anything, right now?
In terms of sort of where people want to put their money, or where
people are putting their media investment dollars.
Interesting. Esports has to be towards the top of the list. Gambling, these kind of fast-growing, maybe previously not legal areas. But I think if you look at Fortnite's numbers, if you look at the attention it gets, this new game Apex, which got hyped by some influencers, I just read on the way here, hit 25 million players this week. Brand new game, free game. The numbers are just incredible. And I know a lot of VCs are increasingly seeing these gamers as the next generation's athletes and celebrities. And that'll drive an economy that is so different, that's frankly out of my comfort zone. Like when I saw the loot box controversy with some YouTubers where they were promoting that, to me it seemed crazy. I was like, this looks like gambling. It's literally a slot machine. It's like, you get a box, maybe there's something good in it. There's probably nothing good in it. But you add YouTube and suddenly it's like, some exciting new thing that a lot of people actually signed up for. So I think the economy around gaming and streaming, it has to be number one. And then I would say also in media, you look at Spotify acquiring Anchor and Gimlet this week. I think there's going to be a lot more to come in the podcast space. But one area I would say you guys should look at is how do podcasts go beyond podcasts to interact with other areas of media? So could a podcast have a sort of streaming component where people are maybe able to influence it live, a little more like online radio, like a hybrid? That's one area. Or will we see exciting interactive shows or game type experiences off of popular podcasts? Like my guilty pleasure is true crime podcasts. I've listened to a lot of those, and some of them are now getting bought by TV stations and stuff. Sure. If I'm a VC in media, that's where I go.
Well, that's a good segue. This is the time in the show when we ask guests to show off their favorite Fortnite emote. No, I'm kidding.
You've never played Fortnite.
I knew what that was, though.
that was more than I know. So you're
I use the right terminology, I think.
But I would say some VCs are still scared of media. So if we're thinking in that focus, let's also not forget that it can be really hard to build a media company at scale. And one thing that I think you guys would appreciate is this increasing recurring debate of, does venture capital fit a lot of media businesses? Is it the right thing?
Gotcha.
Because if there's anything listeners need to know about venture capital, it's that those guys only make money if they basically can get a company to 10 times bigger than where it was when they invested. So if you're not 10x, you're not going to be a win, because a lot of those companies aren't a win at all. So that winner has to kind of bankroll the ones that aren't really winners.
Right.
So some of these successful media companies we'll see, I don't think will take venture dollars. They'll look for other means to grow.
We raised money for one of our brands, Barvin, and it was a funny experience where we talked to some VCs, and we had a especially memorable one where the guy just loved it and he thought it was going to be such a success. And he's like, you know what, guys, like, I hate to tell you, I don't see this being more than a $300 million company.
Oh no.
And I was like, that sounds great. Like, and he's like, it's not good enough for me, you know? Like they need those $1 billion wins to offset. And there's not much in media that gets that big.
He also referenced another deal during that conversation that they had just closed, where the company exited for 6x at what they invested at. Yeah. And he just shakes his head and goes, "What a failure! What a failure!"
I mean, it really depends on when you invested and how much money you have. You know, I think Gimlet, for example, I was shocked to see someone feel like that was not the kind of outcome they wanted for their companies. To me, that's a great success story. Selling for, over $200 million or something like that. Something, several hundred million. But yeah, if you have pressure to build a multi-billion-dollar media company, that might push you to do unnatural things. I'm really rooting for the big ones, Vice, BuzzFeed, Vox. Like, their success is good for everyone, and anyone who wants more good media out there. So no one should be rooting against them. But I think they face tensions to live up to those high expectations.
Sure. Yeah. Well, we operate we call it niche space, and like The Athletic is a brand I follow really closely just because of their business model. But and I agree with you, like esports, athletics, like whenever people have that obsessive nature, it's easier to build a really large company because people will pay for it, even if athletics, like $2 or $3 a month or something, but
and they did raise venture dollars, The Athletic, because
pretty good valuation.
If you think, there are so many sports subcategories and it's such a national audience, they see that scale right there. Yeah. But, in smaller niches, you can build a much more potentially loyal audience that never is going to be viral, but still has value.
Yeah, absolutely.
So Alex, I'd be remiss if I didn't ask, what plugs would you like to give if people want to learn more about what you do, they want to read what you're reporting on, they maybe want to see you on camera at various panels around the world, where can they find you?
Yeah, so I spend way too much time on Twitter, and my handle is Alex, the letter R, and then my last name, Konrad, Alex R. Konrad. I should have gotten at Alex, but I was too late to the game. And I'm always kind of talking about a mix of serious and not serious things there. Like today, Amazon bought a company I like, and so I was polling my followers whether they're more likely to buy that product now it's owned by Amazon, just because I was curious. I'm not actually going to write an article. So yeah, that's a great place to just kind of see how I think, and if you tweet at me, I'll get back to you. Otherwise, if you just search for my name in Forbes, you'll find a nice, easy page of all my portfolio of work. The Midas list will come out in early April. I'll probably have a big meaty story there that I can't talk about yet. So hopefully people can check it out. But frankly, I'm just as happy to talk about unrelated things on social as I am to promote my own work. Yeah.
Thanks so much.
All right, thanks guys.
Yeah.
It was a fun chat.